Welcome to the Tech Talk by Microsoft EMEA. Today we will talk about how to configure remote desktop services with Windows Server 2022. So the Tech Talks, this is a live stream for your questions also. So feel free to put your questions around this topic, remote desktop services in Windows Server, into the chat or into the feedback area on the streaming platform you are watching. And for sure, you can ask your questions, you can give feedback, and you can leave your comments if you think that things should be changed. There should be other topics. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. And today we are talking about remote desktop services. I have a live demo prepared where we will deploy remote desktop services in Windows Server 2022. But we will start with a few words about the architecture of remote desktop services. So remote desktop services, maybe you know them as terminal services or terminal server. This was the previous naming used since Windows Server, I think 2012. It's remote desktop services. So we have the remote desktop services protocol, RDP protocol. We have the remote desktop services themselves, and we have the RDS licensing. This is also important. We will also talk a little bit about the licensing around remote desktop services. When we deploy remote desktop services in the live demo later, we will see that there's a component RD Web Access. RD Web Access helps us to access the desktops via a web page. It's optional. It's your decision if you want to have this web access option installed and configured. If you install this component, you need to configure this component. You need maybe an additional server. It's possible to deploy everything on one machine, but maybe you want to configure this on a dedicated separate machine, maybe because of scalability. The RD Gateway, the Remote Desktop Services Gateway, it's also optional. So I'm using the RD Gateway for many of my live demo environments where I access the remote connection via the Remote Desktop Services Gateway. This helps to ensure that it's not required to publish the RDS session hosts to external location because you access them via the RD Gateway. And the second advantage is you don't need a virtual private network to connect to your network. You only use the RDP gateway. You connect to the RDP gateway and via the RDP gateway to your RDS session host. So the RDS session host, Remote Desktop Services session host, this is where many people still use the wording terminal server. We see two different symbols, RDS on the left-hand side and RDS on the right-hand side. Remote Desktop Services is available in two different flavors. So you can decide to run remote desktop services based on the session virtualization. This is option number one. Session virtualization means you have one or several or many RDS hosts. And on each RDS host, you have several users. They work together and they work together on the same machine, but they have their dedicated sessions. This is important. Session virtualization means every user that logs on has his own individual session, his own individual environment, but they are sharing a host. So what are the advantages or different disadvantages of the session virtualization? The big advantage I see in session virtualization is the easy way to standardize these sessions because you have this single host. Let's imagine you only have one host. It's similar if you have several hosts. But now let's talk about one host. You have one host, and on this single host, maybe you have 20 users that are running their individual RDS sessions. Then you can install an application, and the application is available for every user. You can do some configurations, and the configuration changes are available for every user. So this means session virtualization, from my perspective, very easy to handle if you have standardized desktops, if you have similar desktop environments per user or for every user. It's even easy to manage if you don't have a dedicated management tool. The second advantage of the session virtualization is, in my opinion, the costs. Maybe you have additional ideas, so feel free to bring them up in the chat. But from my point of view, these are the two advantages: easy, standardized sessions with optimized or reduced management effort, and we have the cost reduction, based on the optimized management, but also based on the sharing of the resources. Because you can imagine, if you have one host with several users on this host, then we can optimize the memory, CPU usage, and so on. The option number 2, the RDS host on the right-hand side, is a virtualization-based scenario. Most of you maybe know this as a virtual desktop infrastructure environment. VDI in the Microsoft ecosystem means that we build an RDS scenario where our target machines are virtual Windows clients virtualized on Hyper-V. Important is to know that in this scenario, we have an additional license that's called the Virtual Desktop Access License. This license is available separate as a subscription, and this license is part of the Windows 11 Enterprise upgrade with software assurance. There, this is included, the Virtual Desktop Access License. And this means that in a virtual desktop scenario, in a VDI scenario, we have the situation that every user that connects to this RDS environment receives a dedicated desktop on a dedicated machine. So the advantage is we have the full flexibility of a full featured virtual Windows client. The small disadvantages that we have to manage each of these clients, but for sure you will then use some management tools on premises or cloud-based tools like Intune from Microsoft or Endpoint Manager that includes Intune. And the maybe second small disadvantage is that you need more resources, because I think you can imagine a dedicated virtual machine per user needs more resources based on the dedicated OS installation compared to the session sharing on the left-hand side. The big advantage is that we have more flexibility in providing individual environments. So for sure, also in the session-based scenario number 1, every user has his individual session. But in the virtual desktop-based scenario, the advantage is that every user has his own machine. So every user can install his individual software applications. Compared or in combination with discrete device assignment, we have even in RDS based on session virtualization more flexibility in direction of computer-aided design, video rendering, and so on. What you can see on the right-hand side are the licensing options. So the RDS licensing server is also a server role or a dedicated server that is installed, and the file storage. When we are thinking about users, every user that has a user profile needs some storage where the files are stored, and we can configure this here flexible. And we have the RD Connection Broker. The RD Connection Broker is the component that ensures that our connection that maybe was closed or was lost is reconnected to our initial session. So this is the connection broker. It's always in combination with Active Directory for authentication. So starting with Windows Server 2012 R2, it was not any longer supported to run RDS scenario when you have user-based licensing without an Active Directory domain. In previous versions of Windows Server, it was possible to run in workgroups. Now you really should have an Active Directory domain. It can also be a hybrid deployment. What we here see is the minimum configuration requirement. For sure, this can also be a hybrid scenario. Clients can be Windows, iOS, Android, Mac OS. So every client that provides RDS or RDP compatibility can be used here. If you have questions regarding the architecture, feel free to ask them, because this is exactly what we will build later in the live demo. So I will expect in the live demo that you have heard already these definitions and you understood what the different roles are for. Before we start with the live demo, we should talk a little bit about the licensing options, because in the session-based virtualization scenario, we only need the RDS client access license. In the virtual desktop infrastructure-based scenario, we need additionally the virtual desktop access licenses. And for sure, we can use the remote desktop services to provide full desktops. This is what I explained or described, but we can also publish remote apps. So it's not required that the user always starts a full desktop session on the RDS host. The RDS host can also be used to provide single applications to the client machines. The services and the licensing can be done per device or per user. We are always looking at the accessing objects. So when we license per user, it's relevant for us how many users access the RDS host. When we look at the per device option, it's important to know how many devices will access the RDS host. Depending on the option we have chosen, for example, per device, we can revoke percentage of RDS calls to free them for new devices. We have temporary calls for a specific period of days when a new device enters the environment, but we cannot over allocate the RDS client access license. In the per user scenario, here's important, it cannot be tracked within a workgroup, so it will not work in a workgroup scenario. We have the situation that we cannot revoke the RDS calls, so they are connected to the specific user object. We don't have any temporary RDS client access licenses, but we have the situation that we can over allocate the RDS user client access licenses. Important is, yes, maybe you will violate the license agreement, but maybe you will not violate it because here we can read RDS calls are assigned to user in Active Directory. Yeah, but the user is an individual person. So if you have an Active Directory object like sales or support or sales, we had sales already, support, management or things like this, then it's not okay to use the user calls for these shared accounts. So it's always connected to a real person. So it's a personal per user client access license. So the wording here is not absolutely correct. So this is the technical way how it works. So for each individual, person that wants to use the remote desktop services, we need a per user call if we choose this licensing option. And the assignment is done by the Active Directory user objects. So if we have different versions of remote desktop services, then it's important to know that the later client access licenses, and I had this situation a few weeks ago. This is the old table. There's also a 2022 client access license here. We can verify this when we go to the matching web page here. I can show this to you here. We have the latest version, and we have here also the Windows Server 2022 client access license. Here we have the situation that the newer RDS CAL version is also or can also be used to access the previous RDS session hosts. It's similar to the client access licenses in Windows Server. If you have a newer client access license version of Windows Server, you can use this CAL to access previous Windows Server versions. But the difference is the Windows Server CAL is only a piece of paper. This is not a technical thing that has to be registered. For the Windows Server CAL, we don't have a license server. For the RDS client access license, we have a license server. This means that this license has to be activated. And there you will see issues if you have a newer RDS CAL version but you have a previous licensing server. So even if your licensing server is Windows Server 2019, you will not be able to register the RDS 2022 RDS CAL. So from the licensing perspective, you are allowed to use this. But from the technical perspective, it's not possible to activate this. There it is important to understand that there's a service that's called the clearinghouse service. So when you enter the RDS CALs in your RDS licensing server, then you are asked if you want to call the clearinghouse service. And if you have this situation here, then you should call the clearinghouse service. There you can provide your RDS 2022 license key, and you can downgrade to, for example, 2019 or 2016 or 2012 R2 to use this newer license key with a previous RDS licensing server. This is important to understand because regarding the usage rights, this is absolutely identical from the Windows Server CAL and the RDS CAL. But regarding the handling, the difference is that the Windows Server CAL has to be, the customer has to buy the client access licenses. They have to be documented, but you don't have a technical service where you enter them. For the remote desktop services, we have this technical service to enter them. Okay, the RDS CALs. Hopefully this is clear because we will see something about the RDS server in a few minutes in the live demo. Another important thing is the Office compatibility, but I would say let's talk about this after the live demo. So first we will go to the live demo and I want to connect to a Windows server. And I have already prepared this Windows server with a few things. The server is member of my Active Directory domain. So here we can see the D201 SRV14. It's part of my MHDemoLab.de domain. It's a Windows Server standard. This is absolutely fine to use a standard edition for remote desktop services. In my specific scenario, this is a virtual machine. This is okay and this is supported. So you can run remote desktop services in virtual machines. This is fully supported. For sure, you also have to plan with the required resources here. Okay, first step is to go to Manage Add Roles and Features. Manage Add Roles and Features, and here we'll go to Next. And in the second step, usually we click to Next for the role-based or feature-based installation. Today, we want to have a remote desktop services installation. So there's a dedicated second special option here. So I will choose this remote desktop services here. You can see on the left-hand side in this grayed out next steps, there's a difference. When we select role-based or feature-based installation, we have server selection, server roles, features confirmation. In the remote desktop services, we can see, oh, it switches to deployment type, deployment scenario, role services, RD connection broker, web access, virtualization host, confirmation, or completion. So it's a completely different wizard. So you can also configure remote desktop services via the first option, role-based or feature-based installation. But you don't have a wizard then that knows the dependencies between the services. So I would absolutely recommend you to go to remote desktop services installation. So next, what will we do? A standard deployment. Standard deployment allows you to deploy remote desktop services across multiple servers. Or do I want to choose a quick start? Quick Start allows you to deploy remote desktop services on one server and creates a collection and publishes remote apps. So this is interesting because usually you have a standard deployment. This is with pre-configured values. And you have typically options like manually configure or individual deployment or something like this. Here we have standard or quick start. So in the quick start, it's clear I have less configuration steps or options. You can see on the left-hand side, this is shortened here. In the standard deployment, I will configure this manually. What I will do with you together is we choose the standard deployment, but we build something like the quick start. Yeah, so the result will be in our configuration that everything runs on one server. Let's go the quick start, the standard deployment path. Then the deployment scenario. The question about session-based deployment or virtual machine-based deployment. So we discussed this when we talked about the licensing and the architecture. And here you have to decide. Now we have the standard deployment chosen. We could also build an, let's say, hybrid thing. We could have some users that use a session virtualization and some users that have a virtual desktop infrastructure-based scenario. Because in the beginnings of remote desktop services, the planning guides said, okay, if you have the standard users with their standardized workload, so the typical standard information worker, then this is the typical session-based user with a session virtualization. For the users with more individual requirements, like developers, maybe managers, and so on, we have the virtual desktop infrastructure scenario. And for users that need the full functionality, they usually will have their full-featured client. Both is possible. So in many companies, the employees have a full-featured client, and they have some remote desktop options. Because the advantage of this remote desktop thing is that between the client, so the endpoint, and the RDS host, we only transfer encrypted picture information. It's encrypted graphic stream. So the workload runs on the RDS host environment, so on the sessions or on the virtual machines inside the RDS host environment. And this means that we can ensure that the content and the workload itself and the data is in an environment that is secure based on our security policy. And the endpoint only receives the video stream, so not the data itself, not the content, not the documents, and so on. And so both is a good choice. We want to select the session-based deployment because this is what we typically understand when we talk about the remote desktop services. So we will choose the session-based desktop deployment. Let's go to next. And now we can see, okay, we have several components. We have the connection broker. We talked about this in the overview. We have the web access, and we have the session host. The session host is the central component. So the session host provides the sessions or the applications. I'm always talking about sessions, but this can also be published applications. Okay, let's go to next. So the first question is, which server will be the connection broker? Okay, I will use the server 14. So when you're wondering, how can I get here additional servers? If you want to have a deployment where you say, okay, the connection broker is server 14, the web access is server 15, and the session host is server 16, then you can add these additional servers here on the all servers list. I can show this to you when we have finished this wizard here. So then we have a question. What are you thinking about the changes Microsoft has announced around the Windows Server 2022 and Office 365 or Microsoft 365 apps? I have this topic with me, so we will talk about this in 10 or 15 minutes. Or if the deployment takes longer, I will pick up this topic when we are waiting for the deployment here. So in a few minutes, we will talk about these things here. Okay, so if we want to have different servers, we can add them on all servers. I will show this to you when we finish the wizard here. So the next step is the RD Web Access. So, and here I have a checkbox. Install the RD Web Access role service on the RD Connection Broker server. I can also add this server. So there are different options where I can say, okay, I want to have the same server. Okay, let's go to next. Select the server from the server pool which to install the RD session host. If more than one server is selected, the RD session host role service will be deployed on all of them. This is a farm, and this is very interesting on the remote desktop services to decide not only run one server, but several servers. And this is usually also the advantage I see if I have the standard deployment, not the quick start, because if I run the quick start, I always have the situation that the connection broker and gateway is on one of the nodes. For sure, I can extend by session hosts, but I would always recommend the standard deployment. Then I go to next. And then we have the confirmation, and I have a warning here that says, okay, the session host server will restart. Okay, I cannot avoid this. I want to have the automatic restart, and I want to deploy these roles. Now I have a wizard with 3 steps. Actually, it's still pending. Now then it's deploying the remote, the broker service. Actually, this is installing RD Connection Broker role service. We then will have a deployment of the RD Web Access role service. and so on and so on. So it will configure this step by step. If we have several servers, then it will also include this additional servers. And this is a perfect time. I think it's not so interesting to wait for this installation progress bar here. So I will switch to this topic where we already had question about in the chat. So what's about the support for the Microsoft or Office 365 apps and remote desktop services? So when we look at this matrix here, we can see we are actually installing the Windows Server 2022. And the Windows Server 2022 is end of support in October 2031. I think you know this. We have the end of support for Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 in October next year. And we have the support end for Windows Server 2022 in October 2031. So from today in 9 years. And on Windows Server 2022, when we are running Office, for sure, we have a support for Office 2019. This was the previous Office version. And we have a support for Office LTSC. So the new Office version in the volume licensing environment is called Office LTSC for a long-term servicing channel. You can, and I usually also do this, add the version 2021. So I always speak about Office 2021 LTSC. And there will be an Office, I assume, this is not an announcement but I assume when we look to the past, then it was 2016, 2019, 2021. Maybe there will be an Office 2023 or 2024 LTSC also. So the LTSC, this is not the home and business, but this is a volume license version of Office. To be allowed to use Office in RDS scenarios, you need Office based on the volume license channel. And the Office is not licensed for the terminal server. It's not licensed for the RDS host, but the Office is licensed for the accessing device. So the Office 2019 or Office 2021 LTSC, if we have 10 devices that access an RDS host, we need 10 of these Office 2021 LTSC licenses. So we have 10 devices that access an RDS host. We need 10 of these licenses, not 11. We don't need an additional license for the RDS host. But it's also not okay to only have one license for the RDS host and no licenses for the accessing clients. Because when we look at the licensing terms, there's no license for the RDS host itself. We need a qualifying license on the device that accesses the RDS host. There's nothing new. We know this since years. But what is interesting and new and what we should know is that the Microsoft 365 apps, maybe you know about this change of the wording we already had last year. The Office 365 family that includes applications like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, renamed the package where we have the apps in there. So this Office applications from Office 365 apps to Microsoft 365 apps. So we have Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise and Microsoft 365 apps for business. And the Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise that were previously the Office 365 apps And these functionalities also included in the Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 plan, and also in the Microsoft 365 Business Premium, but only from the business family, only in the Business Premium. This Microsoft 365 apps is very popular via the app subscription itself or via E3, E5 plan, the Business Premium plan. And these plans that includes the Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, they include the usage rights for RDS scenarios. This means you are allowed to use with your licensed user the Office on up to 5 personal computer devices, 5 tablets, 5 smartphones, and on an RDS host. It's additionally, it's not a replacement, it's an additional, because the Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise include the shared computer activation. This is the licensing perspective. When you try to install this Microsoft 365 apps on a Windows Server 2022 based terminal server, then you will see this works. This works today. This worked 4 weeks ago. This worked last year. So when Windows Server 2022 was announced or was published, when it was general available, this combination worked. But what does this NA mean? It's not supported. This here is the support matrix. This is not the licensing matrix. This is not the what technically works matrix. But if you want to have a specific implementation at your customer side, you have to ensure that it works from a technical perspective. You must ensure that you are allowed to use this regarding the licensing terms. And then usually you will ensure that it is supported by the software vendors, so by Microsoft. Because if it's not supported, the issue is if anything does not work and you contact the Microsoft support, the Microsoft support will say, oh, sorry, it's not supported. We cannot help you and we will not help you. So this is important to understand. The Microsoft 365 apps are not supported on Windows Server 2022. They were never planned to be supported on Windows Server 2022 because when Windows Server 2019 was general available, Microsoft said, oh, we will not support the Microsoft 365 apps. In those days, these were the Office 365 apps. But then Microsoft said, oh, we heard to the customer feedback, and we had many customers that said, we need this support. So Microsoft said, okay, we will provide the support for Windows Server 2019 again. And more than 1 year after Windows Server 2019 was launched, Microsoft provided this support for the Microsoft 365 apps. But Microsoft said in the next version of Windows Server, we will not do this again. We will not support the apps. And why will Microsoft not support the apps? So why has Microsoft this problem in supporting the apps? Let's talk about the different life cycle. Microsoft 365 apps. This is a modern life cycle application. This means once a month, we have a new version of the apps. The Windows Server, it's a long-term servicing platform. This means a customer can buy this server and run the server 10 years without changing the version. I only have to install the security updates and hotfixes. Version upgrades, it's my decision. In the Microsoft 365 apps, in the modern lifecycle application, and for example, also in the Windows client, something like Windows 11, it's not my choice to upgrade to new versions. When Microsoft publishes a new version, I have a specific time period I can use to install this new version. For example, in Windows 11, we have a new version once a year. The version 22 H2 was released a few days or weeks ago. And now a Windows 11 Pro customer has 24 months to install this version. An enterprise customer has 36 months, so 2 or 3 years to install this new version. But Microsoft can be ensured that in later 3 years, everybody is on 2020 H2. And if not, this customer is not any longer supported. In Windows Server, we don't have this situation. Now you can imagine that it is difficult to bring an application that has a modern life cycle together with an OS platform that has a fixed life cycle or long-term servicing channel life cycle. Because when we think about Windows Server, 10 years support. In this 10 years, we have 120 new versions of Microsoft 365 apps. And they all have to be supported if Microsoft opens the support for the apps. So I absolutely can understand this limitation from the technical perspective. But on the other hand, the customers are asking for it. So the customers don't care about these life cycle things. They only say, oh, we have an RES scenario. We want to run the Microsoft 365 apps there. And the first answer was that Microsoft said, okay, then you can license Office 2019 or 2021 LTSC. But the customer said, yeah, but we bought the Microsoft 365 licenses, or we have a subscription for the Microsoft 365 licenses. We don't want to have additional licensing costs. So Microsoft said, okay, we heard your feedback again, dear customers. We will have a look at the support for Microsoft 365 apps on Windows Server. And the discussion already started at the end of last year, but the first feedback from Microsoft was in September. So we can see here the 6th of September. Weldon Christensen wrote, okay, we will check if this can be possible. Then on Friday, the 14th October, we had a new post from Microsoft that said, okay, we will add the support for Microsoft 365 apps to Windows Server 2022. But not today. And this is important to understand. When we go to the web, to LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you are looking for news around Microsoft technologies, you will read in those days very often Microsoft adds or Microsoft added support for Microsoft 365 apps to Windows Server 2022. But this did not happen today. This is important to know. So today we still don't have the support. Microsoft says support for running Microsoft 365 apps on Windows Server 2022 is currently in preview. So if the preview shows that there are issues, that this will be not possible, then we will not get a support for Microsoft 365 apps on Windows Server 2022. So it's in preview. Microsoft is testing this. It's not available today. When you are asking me when we will have the support for the Microsoft 365 apps, then here we can read, we will provide information which version of Microsoft 365 apps are supported on Windows Server 2022 at a later date. Later this month, later this year, somewhere next year. We don't know this because actually it's in testing. This means, and we have a comment, maybe this is not perfect for trustworthy. In my opinion, this is not an issue of trusting in what Microsoft said, because Microsoft always says, if you issues or if you want other things in the products, please give feedback. There are several feedback platforms for Microsoft. And many customers gave feedback about the Microsoft 365 apps in Windows Server. From the technical perspective, if you say, okay, let's talk about Microsoft. Only let's imagine there's an OS platform from any vendor that has a long-term channel that is supported for 10 years. The customer don't want to have any changes in there. And on the other hand, we have a modern application that brings an update every month. And I have to install these updates in a very short time period. Then everybody that's a little bit familiar with Technics, I think will agree with me that this is difficult to bring this together. And on the other hand, Microsoft has the customers that say, okay, but we want to run this together. We have the requirement to have this together. And Microsoft listens to these customers. But it's no announcement or anything like this. But think a little bit further what maybe can happen in the next step. There will be a new version of Windows Server in 2 or 3 years. So the release cadence for Windows Server is 2 to 3 years. So I assume that we will have a new Windows Server version maybe in 2025 or something like this. And we will have again the situation that from the technical development here, it's very difficult to bring together this new Windows Server release with the modern lifecycle applications. And if the customers have more and more demand, what would I do as a software vendor? I would say, okay, maybe the customers want to have a modern lifecycle server release. Maybe the customers want to have a new server release every 2 or 3 years. They have to install within 2 years. And I'm pretty sure that this is absolutely not what the customers want. So I'm not sure what I should think about this. So I think there are many modern technologies like Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop that don't require to run this modern lifecycle applications on a Windows Server platform. But for sure, if you are the customer and if you are running RDS for years, you will not be happy with the situation that the modern applications are not supported there. We don't want to go too deep into discussion if this is good or not good. So I would be happy if you spend some time to think about my words about this compatibility. That's, in my opinion, not a thing of trustworthy or that Microsoft wants to force us in one or in the other direction. But from the technical perspective, it's really difficult to bring this together. So important today, 24th October 2022, we still have the situation Windows Server 2022 and the Microsoft 365 apps are not supported together. So when you run them today, you could have run them half a year ago. You could have implemented a terminal server or RDS host with Windows Server 2022 in August, September last year. So today, it's still not supported. In the future, it's relatively, I'm also relatively sure, I cannot guarantee this, but it's relatively sure that Microsoft will add this support. Microsoft will not add this support to an unlimited time. They already announced this. They will add the support till October 2026. It's comparable to what Office LTSC does. But I'm pretty sure that this will be realized. I'm pretty sure that this will be announced, but I cannot guarantee when this will be announced. Okay, and if you're looking for these new things like Windows 11 in combination with Microsoft 365 apps, You can do this in a virtual desktop infrastructure scenario. You can do this in Windows 365. You can use this in Azure Virtual Desktop, and you can use this in Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. So there are many new options. This is my recommendation to have a look at this. But if you prefer to run the RDS the traditional way, then you will have the support later in 2022 or 2023. There's no final date in the list, but always keep in mind today it's only for testing. It's not supported for production environment. Okay, let's have a look at our deployment. So we had enough time to wait for the server restart. I will log on to the RDS host. I will use the administrator at mhdemolab.de. I will enter the password here. And then let's check what the configuration did. Now it's completing the configuration here on the machines. We needed the restart for the session host. Now the role service implementation is still in progress. To fill the time till this installation finishes, let's go to another machine here. Here, this is another Windows server. This server is in the work group, so let's take this one here. Let's take this machine. So this is a Windows Server 2022 also. It's a data center, but this is that is not relevant. And here we can see remote desktop is disabled on this server 12. Different server, different scenario. If you enable this server remote, the remote desktop access, remote desktop on this computer, then we have the situation we don't have an RDS host. This is only a remote desktop connectivity for administrative tasks. So this RDP or RD remote desktop services enablement here is only for admin, no licensing, administration only, no RDS CAL required, no RDS CAL included. This is important because when you enable remote desktop here, you have 3 sessions, 1 console session and 2 remote sessions. But this does not mean that you have 3 RDS client access licenses included. This only means that you can use remote desktop to manage this server for administrative tasks. It has nothing to do with the role administrator. So if you are an administrator in Active Directory, this does not mean that you can do anything on this server. If you use the server, so if my user Manfred is part of the domain administrators, and I'm connecting this server to run a locally installed Word or Excel or PowerPoint to do my preparations here, then I need RDS CALs for me and the other users that are using this machine. So this is important. This configuration here only for administrative tasks. This is not an RDS host. This is only for management. No RDS CALs included. We don't need RDS CALs here. On the deployment on the server 14 that has finished now, I can close this here. Now here we have an RDS configuration. And here we can see, okay, this machine has an web access server. It's a little bit untypical that this icon is in gray. Usually we would expect some colors, but this is the default visualization here. We have the connection broker. We don't have a virtualization host because we decided for the RD session host. And now we can add the gateway and the licensing via clicking on this plus. The gateway is optional. Yeah, it's my decision. The licensing has to be installed within 120 days after deploying the RDS host. So for the first 120 days, we don't need a license server from the technical perspective. From the licensing perspective, we have to be licensed already now. So here we can see the servers in the list, and in the collections, we have our sessions we provide. Here we can configure a session collection. And I could say, okay, I have a new session collection. This is a session collection 01, for example. And I can decide for my session collection host. I can decide for the user and groups. I could say I have also the domain admins. Usually you would use your own groups, but I want to have this in a short time. We only have 3 minutes left, so I will add my domain administrators. I can decide if I want to use a user profile disk. I can confirm this. Then I will have a session collection here. And then I can add the applications to the session collection. So here I have the session collection 01, and I could add the remote app programs and the published desktops. So it depends on what I want to provide here. Okay. So, as I mentioned, we are already at the end of the time of this Tech Talk. If you have any questions about remote desktop services, feel free to bring them up in the chat. Also, your feedback is welcome, also critical feedback. We have this feedback about trustworthy and the support life cycle. And if you have more questions about different topics, not only remote desktop services, but for sure also remote desktop services, then feel free to join tomorrow the Tech Talk. There we have a Tech Talk support hour also at 11:30, where I have 1 hour for all your questions. On the October 31st, so next week, Monday, again at 11:30 German time, so the time in your time zone where you joined, we will talk about how to install and configure Active Directory domain services and for or on Windows Server 2022. So hopefully you will find time to join tomorrow the Tech Talk Q&A, and next week Monday the Tech Talk about Active Directory domain services and DNS. Now feel free to bring up your feedback to the chat. I will close this session now. Say thank you for your time. Thank you to Microsoft EMEA for supporting the Tech Talks, and see you tomorrow at 11:30 for the Tech Talk Q&A. Bye.